Hello and welcome to Recap, Per Capita's research and policy podcast, where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in our fight for a fairer Australia. We're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm Sarah McKenzie. I am the Acting Executive Director of Per Capita, and I am joined today by Emma Dawson, who has recently moved on from her long-held role as Per Capita's Executive Director to begin a new role as the Executive Director of Chifley Research Centre. Hey, Emma.
Hello, good to be with you.
Today, we're unpacking a milestone in Australian political history. When Parliament resumes, we will have our first gender-equal federal parliament ever to sit in this country. Labor won 94 seats in the House of Representatives, and 50 of those will be held by women, which means that 1 in every 3 members in the lower house will be a Labor woman. Over the past 30 years, we've seen a really massive change in the makeup and gender makeup of our parliament, which I had a look at in a recent Per Capita blog, A Question of Quotas. And Emma is here to help us dive a bit deeper into the story behind this milestone and have a bit of a chat about what comes next. So we're going to go back to the top. We're about to open our first gender equal parliament in our history. It's largely driven by female representation among Labor parliamentarians. This hasn't always been the case. 10 parliaments ago, Labor had 15% female representation, less than Liberal National Coalition, less than average. So, Emma, how did we go from having a major party with 15% female representation to over 50% in just 10 parliaments' time?
Well, the short answer is through a lot of hard work, effort, and persistence by generations of Labor women and allies in the party. In 1994, originally, so just over 30 years ago, at National Conference, Labor set a target to have gender representation in the party, so equal representation for women at 30%. And then over years ramped that up so that by 2015, there was a decision to set a final target of all 50% of all pre-selected candidates would be women by 2025. And we beat it. We got there in this parliament. We see, as you said at the outset, Sarah, the first majority Labor parliament in Australia's history, and really critically, actually the first majority or gender equal Labor cabinet in the government. So we have an equal number of men and women around that important decision-making table. But yeah, it wasn't arrived at by accident. It was through a lot of hard work and persistence, and it took various motions that were supported as well by men in the Labor Party, some fierce resistance at the start, lots of very familiar arguments about getting pre-selected on merit and so forth, and those were overcome through the party's traditional process of robust internal debate and evidence-based arguments. And so we now find ourselves 30 years later with having achieved that in what was for many, many years a very male-dominated culture in the Labor Party. And we've seen the results of that in this parliament, and we'll see it and are seeing it in policy making as well.
Thanks. So when I was having a look into this, what I found was that the raw numbers are great, but they don't really tell us the whole story. So when you sort of zoom in on women, especially women in the coalition, but all women in the lower house, they are far less likely to retain their seats after just one term, so a higher one-term attrition rate than their male counterparts. What are some of the things behind that?
So traditionally, of course, when you make changes like this, at first women were pre-selected, but they were tending to be pre-selected into marginal seats, into very unsafe seats, and that's still the case in many areas, and particularly in the coalition parties. And so, in that case, those seats tend to swing much more between elections. So one of the natural attrition things that would happen is women would lose their seat after the first term that they were sitting in Parliament. But Labor since addressed that. We have now rules around the kind of seat that women are meant to be considered for, so that there's an equal opportunity for those safe seats as well. Again, we don't see this on the other side of the chamber. But I think it's a broader question too about the nature of work, the nature of life in Canberra, which is very traditionally structured along gender lines. So the long sitting days, the amount of travel involved, the need, even when you're not in Parliament. A lot of people like to joke that parliamentarians only work 20 weeks a year because that's how long Parliament sits. But anyone who's run for or has a family member or friend who's run for office knows most of the work goes on outside Parliament, constituents matters and local electorate issues and so on. Committee work between sittings. There's a lot of time involved in being a parliamentarian, and it helps to have a wife. It helps to have someone at home that's helping with the home front. So until those structural changes start to filter through, not just in Parliament, but in our workplace and family structures more broadly, I think it'll always be more challenging for women to take up these roles. And we need to see changes made to ensure that it's a more family friendly and a less intensive work environment. Something else, though, I think that this Parliament will show is because women now not just make up over 50% of the caucus, but are equally represented in those ministry roles, they're more likely to stick around if they're given those opportunities and have that more interesting and more challenging work to do and can see that pathway through from being pre-selected to becoming a first-term MP, then working your way up to a ministry. So as long as those ministerial positions were kind of protected for the boys' club, women would tend to say, well, how long do I give my life to this if I'm not going to have that opportunity? Or for those MPs that want to become ministers, not all do, of course, but often in the past, I think we lost some very promising, very ambitious women because of that frustration that just getting your foot in the door isn't enough. It's about being invited to make a difference. And again, we've seen that in a lot of the policy outcomes in the first term of this government that have been driven by women too.
Thanks. And obviously, the Liberal Party has just elected their first female leader. Do you think, you said before about people being selected in difficult seats? Obviously, it's not a difficult seat as much, but do you think that is a sign of change for the party, or is it just a sort of another example of putting a woman into a very difficult position and then asking her to swim or sink?
Look, it does seem to be. Let's not be too cynical about it, and let's congratulate Susan Lee for being the first woman to lead the coalition, to lead the Liberal Party, and to be the leader of an opposition in this country. Labor's never had a female opposition leader. We only ever had a female Prime Minister. I would suggest that's slightly better, but there you go. Uh, but yes, there is certainly a history. And if you look back at the first female leaders in the Labor Party at state level, Carmen Lawrence in WA, Joan Kerner in Victoria, they tended to be brought in towards the end of a successful term of government when there wasn't much prospect of their party holding on or of them winning another election, or at times of crisis. And that's pretty much what we're seeing now in the Liberal Party. They've been reduced to, I think it's 28 seats in the lower house. There wasn't a lot of competition for that role. There were two contenders for the role. It was a very closely fought election. I think she only won 29 to 25 votes over Angus Taylor anyway. And of course, within days of taking the leadership, the coalition imploded, although they look to be facing a rapprochement now. So yeah, women do tend to get given the chance to lead when things are dire, when they're in trouble. We see that internationally as well. Theresa May sort of coming in the UK after the original Brexit shambles. The less said about Liz Truss, the better. But it does tend to be the case that when the very ambitious men see, well, this isn't a good time to be leader of the party because we're in complete disarray. There's very little chance. There are actually no, throughout history, very few opposition leaders that come in after a big loss and then go on to win an election and become Prime Minister. So it tends to be a bit of a poison chalice when it's first handed to women.
Yeah, that's a bit of a shame, but we will see. Perhaps I'm being a bit pessimistic about it.
Right to be
so,
cynical.
I am very interested in the number of women who sit in our parliaments, not just because I am a woman and I love the girls, but because I'm interested in what that does and how it shifts the policy agenda. Can you speak a bit to that, whether you think it has a big impact on it, and if so, how we see that?
Yeah, of course. And just during the election campaign, of course, you and I hosted an event that went through some of those policy wins in the first term Albanese government that were specifically wins for women and girls. If you look at what was legislated in that first term and the overall approach that the government took to, where they very explicitly made, for example, early childhood education and care a centrepiece of their election campaign, that they spoke very positively about growing the care economy and investing in the care economy. So they did things like lifted those wages for early childhood workers and for aged care workers. They abolished the activity test so that children get 3 days of guaranteed subsidised childcare whether their parents are working or not. They reinstated single parenting payment to single mothers in single parent families are 78% led by women until the youngest child turns 14, up from 8. Which was originally changed by John Howard and then cemented by Julia Gillard. They've invested in paying students of feminised sectors such as nursing and midwifery and social work and teaching payments for their compulsory prac placement. So previously, students of those caring and teaching professions were having to do unpaid hours up to 40 weeks, equivalent of 40 weeks full-time work without pay. They have invested in massive women's health initiative, reproductive health initiative under the former Assistant Minister for Women's Health, Jed Carney, who's now Assistant Minister for Social Services, and prevention of family violence. They have invested a lot of money into the prevention of violence. They've highlighted and prioritised housing in the new housing build for women and children fleeing domestic and family violence. The list goes on and on and on. And I'd point you to Per Capita's recording of that event on its website, and you can hear the actual real facts from Katie Gallagher, the Minister for Women. These things happen because women are in the room. Decisions are made by the people in the room, and not just based on the evidence before them, but on their experience of the world. And issues that previously were regarded as not the government's business, or we often heard about, and they're still described in economic textbooks as government spending, ongoing government spending, that these investments in care and in the foundational side of our economy where women tend to work, and in measures that alleviate the economic burden of unpaid domestic work are dismissed in economic textbooks, but there's a growing awareness in our government that actually our economy runs on this stuff, that runs on the unpaid work of women. And a lot of that really has only come to the fore of the thinking of the government because the government is 50% female. It is led by women that have experience of single parenthood. Katie Gallagher, that is a former nurse in Jed Carney, women that have worked uh, with early childhood educators and on their behalf for years and years, like Jess Walsh. And so bringing that, not just their experience of being women, but their understanding of how the world works for women from a first-hand perspective into policy making has been absolutely critical for some of those big initiatives we've seen in the first term of this government, and the commitments for the second too.
Okay, great. So good policy outcomes. Now, over the last couple of weeks, as after any election, parties are looking at what went wrong, what we could have done better, etc. And the Liberal Party have started talking about quotas again. Now, this isn't the first time; it comes up every couple of years that somebody, not only women, but people within the Liberal Party, will start talking about quotas. And considering that it comes up regularly, and then very little action is taken on it. But also considering that we know that the policy agenda is better for women when women are in government. What are your thoughts about something more radical like legislated quotas like we see in countries like France and Spain, requiring parties to put forward equal or a percentage of women candidates, and using things like financial penalties, like not giving them as much funding for the election, public funding, if they don't comply? What are your first sort of thoughts on that?
My initial reaction to that is that it's a little bit of overreach and unlikely to be as effective as we would like. I mean, the change needs to be embraced by the party, and that's the thing we've seen with Labor. Yes, it took a long time. Um, But if it's forced on an organisation from outside, or if it's imposed upon a body that thinks of itself as, and is rightly, a political party, an organisation that coheres around a set of ideas and ideologies and approaches to life, you can't just, quotas are important, right? So this may sound a little contradictory, what I'm about to say. You can't change hearts and minds just by imposing numbers on them. The change will take time. Now, if quotas were to be legislated and imposed on the party from outside, according to the theory, yes, over time more women would enter their ranks, and so the culture would change and you would shift gradually towards that being embraced. But I'm not sure that, not being a creature of the Liberal Party or the National Party and understanding how their internal debates go on, I'm not sure that you overcome the ideological objections and persuade people along that path if it's seen to be being imposed from outside. What happened in Labor, it was developed from the inside by Labor Party members who happen to be women and their allies. And so over time, then, as women come into the party, there is that openness and change that is happening within the movement itself. And so when we get to gender parity, we don't have a resistance then to saying, well, you're here and you're going to be sitting around the cabinet table. My concern is if it's imposed from outside the organisation onto the coalition, that the hearts and minds don't actually change along with that you don't have champions within the party that are going to push it. There are some very bright young Liberal women, Charlotte Mortlock and others, that are trying to get quotas up within their party, and I think they need to be supported to do so, because as they do it from the inside, it's much more likely to achieve support over time, so that you don't end up with a situation where you've got a Liberal national coalition, if they reform, that in 5 years' time has to replace 30% of its MPs with women, and don't actually want to do that. You would then find, I think, that not only would that lead to an even more fractious coalition opposition than we've got at the moment, but mean that those women faced a lot of internal resistance and were not promoted and not allowed to succeed on their merits. But as you say, there are quotas in place in other countries. How they work in other countries is worth looking at. Whether or not their electoral systems are similar to ours, I would imagine it's easier to have quotas in multi-party jurisdictions, for example, where you don't have sort of one seat, one member, and those would work better in some European countries. But I do think that the shift is starting to happen within the Liberal Party itself, in particular, with some of those movements, Hilmer's Network and others. And I personally think that's the best way to do it. But quotas, while they are seen as just imposing numbers, the reason they work is because over time they bring in people who otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity. So it's not that they're not getting there on merit, it's because a quota requires those with existing power to think differently about how they recruit the next generation of power. So it's not that it bypasses merit, it's that it allows us to see merit where we might otherwise have overlooked that merit, because men tend to look at other men. We're all guilty of this. We recognise similarities in people to ourselves, and so we have an innate tendency to try to replicate our own experience, and what a quota does is force you to look at other people.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was great. I suppose when we start talking about quotas, and yeah, I think you make a good point. It's typical of me thinking that I can solve every problem with the law. I still think we can solve a lot of problems with legislative change, but
well, you wouldn't be in public policy if you didn't.
But no, you make a good point, and I think it is useful to look at other countries and other jurisdictions, but you cannot just pick up an idea and import it to another country without considering different cultures. And obviously we are a compulsory voting country, so just over 50% of the voting population is a woman or identifies as a woman. And so, you kind of go, well, let's leave it to the voters, which I understand. I suppose when we talk about quotas, there's always talk about other sorts of quotas, whether that's in the Australian Labor Party or whether anywhere within the parliament. How much, as we've said, we've got women in decision making seats. We get a higher, or we get more policy agenda for women. Will we see the same if we say have more people of colour sitting in those seats, or other groups that may not be represented in the same way in our parliament as they are in our society?
Yeah, I'm yet to be convinced that quotas will work outside of gender. There are distinct, biological, cultural, experiential differences based on our gender um, that put us into, notwithstanding people with diverse gender identities, or intersex conditions, or trans people, but that divides us into two pretty, big groups in society. And when we look at things like, for example, cultural background or racial background, what's important is not that we have a direct proportional number, a proportional number of people of, say, Chinese background in the parliament as are in the population, or of First Nations people in the parliament as are in the population, but that the parliament as a whole reflects what society looks like. So if you start to bring in quotas on things like racial background or cultural identity, you then get into a very tricky. I mean, Australia's primarily an immigrant country. Unless you're a First Nations person, you've come from somewhere in the past few generations. Over half of us have a parent born overseas. So how many different communities then are jostling for a place in the parliament? The parliament's there to represent us as Australians. So I don't hold much truck with the argument that there should be parliamentarians that are voted in to represent particular ethnic groups, for example, or particular people of particular cultural background. What's important is that our experience as Australians from all backgrounds, and that can be influenced by our status as an immigrant or a refugee or a person of colour, and the discrimination we experience because of that, is brought into our parliament. I think that happens. That's the responsibility of political parties to be engaged in a real way with their community. And this is actually one of the most culturally diverse parliaments as well, again, largely thanks to the entry of MPs from the Labor Party from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, from different immigrant communities, but all of whom have one thing in common, which is that they are, or two things in common: they are Australians and they are members of the Australian Labor Party that have put up their hand to serve their community. That's where that diversity needs to come through, in my view. If you started looking at quotas, and others have made arguments for things like class quotas. So we need a quota of people from working class backgrounds. Well, how do you define a working class background? How far back do you go if somebody becomes a parliamentarian and they were elected on the fact that they had a low income, for example? They don't have a low income anymore as soon as they go into parliament. So are they considered working class?
Sure. No, I mean that is the interesting thing to me around class and background. And of course, every year Per Capita does the weigh in, and we've been looking at secondary school, and it doesn't show exactly what you'd think, say, in the UK when we go, you're a private school, you're a government school. Obviously, there's other factors here, but I mean, that is what is interesting to me. And whilst the rise of independence has boosted the number of women in parliament, you need a lot of money to run a campaign as an independent. So at the very least, at least the Liberal Party, the National Party and the Labor Party have pathways for ordinary people to enter into parliament without needing to raise millions and millions first.
Yeah, that's
So
right, Sarah.
I suppose, yeah, I hear that.
You and I have talked about this, and while I think the rise of particularly the so-called teal independence, a movement of effectively professional, highly educated white women from quite privileged backgrounds who have, if not their own enough of their own money, but a network of people that can fund them, whether that's because they're running in wealthy electorates and their constituents can afford to support them, or they can draw on the backing of high net worth people, high net worth individuals through Climate 200. They are a particular class cohort themselves, and it is virtually impossible for somebody to run for Parliament if they don't have that level of cultural, economic and social capital. So that in a way is also privilege reproducing itself. And so I think, and I know you agree, we feel strongly about this, that the benefit of parties, and particularly of a movement like the Labor Party that was based in the labour movement, working class people, is that it can give people the opportunity to access networks of influence and power and to access politics in a way that they wouldn't have if they were not part of that party, because they simply, as an individual, don't have the social, cultural, economic capital to play the game.
Yeah, that is right. Well, I do think at per capita, at least as we continue to do the way in, we'll keep on looking at these and how they are showing up in our parliament. Of course, quotas are one way. There's lots of other examples from around the world, and I think we should always be thinking about how we change or maintain our parliament into the future and whether it still serves us into the future. I personally hope reserved seats at least comes up as a conversation one day. And, I do want us to be having these big conversations. They don't have to eventuate in anything, but they are worth having, particularly as we move into this whole new world. So thank you very much for joining us today, Emma. Don't forget, Per Capita Podcasts has more shows that you can enjoy, including Burning Platforms, Homes Not Houses, and our John Cain Lunch series. So make sure you subscribe to Per Capita, either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And if you want to get the latest news from Per Capita, please subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that at percapita.org.au. I'd like to thank Morris Blackburn Lawyers for sponsoring this season of Recap. And thank you for listening. Thank you, Emma, for joining. And I've been Sarah McKenzie.